And we're recording. Okay, Professor Goodman.
Hello, everybody. I am really happy to be here, and I want to start by thanking you for having me, and for all of you for coming tonight, for showing up tonight. There's a bunch of people I want to start out by thanking, actually, because I should thank Megan in particular for facilitating this and inviting me to do this. It's really an honor. And I want to thank Caroline Andler for responding generously when I reached out of the blue. She got emails from me saying like, "Hey, I'm working on your ancestor," and she was really responsive and kind. Courtney Cottrell also, I want to thank for talking with me about Brothertown and giving me feedback on my research. And then Gabriel, nice to meet you over Zoom, and thank you for sharing your research with me so far. And even though he's not here, I think maybe some of you know Seth Wenger at Yale. He also was really generous with sharing. I watched the video that he made with the singing event from 2 Februaries ago, which was marvelous, really moving. And I really appreciate that he has shared this with me. And he's been sharing some of the papers he's been writing for graduate school too, which I've enjoyed. So as Megan said, I'm a music professor. And so at the University of Pennsylvania, I teach and I research American music more broadly, pretty broadly. I teach everything from surveys of popular music to really focused graduate seminars on like music and the history of printing music and stuff like that. But before I became a professor, I actually have a background as a performer. I'm a musician, classically trained violist, and sort of the experience of making, thank you for that little fist pump, Gabriel. The experience of making music and how incredibly wonderful it is to have that social experience of making music really informs everything I do when I research music historically. So, and I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, for those of you who are interested in, where people were born and raised. So that's a suburb of DC. And I think it's kind of ironic. I was raised Quaker, which, as some of you might know, is a very quiet denomination. And so it's kind of ironic that I now study sacred music, given that I did not grow up singing it at all. But I guess that's how it goes. Anyway, so my interests really broadly are kind of twofold. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background of how I ended up researching Joseph Johnson. And it really has to do with my interest in both understanding what music meant to people in the past, and then also at a sort of meta level, I'm interested in how we even come to know how music sounded in the past and what it meant to people, because of course it's ephemeral usually. And so sort of even getting to how it would have sounded and what it would have meant poses these kinds of problems that like kind of creative problems about how do you even get at this material. So today I am going to share with you some research that I've done about Joseph Johnson, and in particular, some manuscript music books that he himself made during one winter when he was in Farmington, Connecticut. And I'm going to come at those manuscript books by talking about the kinds of sources I've found that describe early Native American hymnody more broadly, because I think if I can share with you these kinds of sources, some of which very well may be familiar to some of you, it can help showcase exactly how exceptional Joseph Johnson was. And I don't use that word exceptional lightly. I think there really is something unusual about what he accomplished. And then it also casts into high relief the fact that what he accomplished in making music books is, there's a tragedy there because the music books have now been lost. And part of what I've been doing in my research is figuring out how to reconstruct these manuscript books. Because they're gone doesn't mean we just sort of have to throw up our hands and figure there's nothing we can know about them. So I'm going to share some of the strategies I've been coming up with for how to reconstruct them. So I'll start with sharing some of the kinds of materials that I've worked with in the past when I've been addressing early Christian Native American singing. And it's always, I focus on New England. And one of the things I've looked at are early descriptions from English colonists where they describe Native American hymnody. So these are sources that are often kind of biased or quite biased because they reflect an English cultural sensibility, and often they had no capacity to understand Native, like Algonquian Indian musical aesthetics and values. So they were applying their English values to it, but still the sources can be kind of interesting. So I have a couple of examples that I thought I would just share with you. I'm reading from my screen here. There's some descriptions from the mid 17th century, so from the 1650s, when ministers and the governor from Boston went to visit a very newly established Native American Christian community, maybe just inland from Boston a little bit. And they hear these, they're primarily Nipmuc Indians singing Christian sacred music, and these Puritan men are really overcome with the experience of getting to hear this. It's completely shocking. So one of them, a minister named John Wilson, says that he was amazed by the, quote, great devotion, gravity, decency, readiness, and affection that he heard with this psalm singing. And the governor was there, the Massachusetts governor was there too. And he said that even though he couldn't understand it because they were singing in the Massachusetts dialect, he said that what he heard was, quote, with such reverence, zeal, good affection, and distinct utterance that I could not but admire it. And he continues to say, to speak truly, I could hardly refrain from tears for the very joy to see their diligent attention. So he's painting this picture of being profoundly moved by hearing this native Christian psalmody that's singing psalms. But we might have some reason to doubt the sincerity of these men. These kinds of sources that come from English colonists are a little bit dicey because they're always writing for a particular audience that they have in mind. So they might be sort of spinning their narrative a little bit. And in this case, the audience was their funders, the people who gave them money in England. So maybe they're kind of trying to sell this experience a little bit. And also, no matter what their intentions were, it doesn't really tell us anything about how it sounded. So if you're interested in the history of music and how it sounded, this mostly tells you about how these Puritan men felt. So it's not particularly useful in that regard. And so similar sources like this appear for 100 years later with the Brothertown ancestors who migrated before they migrated to Oneida. And I think this is like a really interesting point that you continue to get these descriptions of Native American Christians singing from roughly the same geographic area that continue to be very vague. But now what's really cool is that you start getting those descriptions from people like Sansom Occam. So it's no longer from English people, just from English people observing Native American singing. It's from people like Occam, who himself gets to describe the singing experience, which is really cool. So Occam, as some of you probably know, if you're familiar with anything like his diary, he describes singing hymns just constantly. It seems like every time he shows up somewhere, he's like, and we sang hymns, which is marvelous, right? It's clearly a really important part of how he maintained a sense of fellowship everywhere he went, because of course he was traveling so much. But the person I've been researching, Joseph Johnson, also mentions hymns in his diary, and that's what I'm going to zero in on. So if we think about this in terms of how special it is that we have these sources from Native Americans and not just from English colonists, because it's kind of unusual, and then to zero in even more on Johnson, we can see some pretty remarkable things. So I've been digging into, and I should say, please interrupt me at any point if you have questions about what I'm saying, or thoughts you want to share. So I've been digging into this one winter that Johnson spent in Farmington, Connecticut. Maybe this is familiar to some of you. He spent the winter of 1772 to 1773 in Farmington, this like beautiful town about 30 miles west of Hartford. I actually just drove through there coincidentally. It was my first time actually being in Farmington. And it's in a river valley. The the land is known as Tunxus Seepus, or the named for the bend in the river that sort of holds the town. And the Tunxus Indians, of course, are the original sort of caretakers of the land. So it's this beautiful, fertile river valley to which English colonists began to arrive in the 1640s. And in the next century, Native Americans, from Quinnipiac and Wangunk tribes also began to arrive. So by the time Johnson gets there, it's this multi-tribal Native community, and they're Christian. They've converted to Christianity. While they are there, while Johnson is there, he documents this very robust, regular hymn singing practice, in which he arrives in November, and within a week, he's like, "Oh, I'm going to set up a weekly or bi-weekly, so twice a week singing evening for the Native community." And it starts happening in the houses of some of his Tunxus hosts, Tunxus and Quinnipiac hosts, so like Samuel Adams, who's Quinnipiac, and Thomas Ockerum. They begin to just have the community over on Friday and Tuesday evenings for group hymn singing. And again, there's no description of exactly what this entails, although I have some hypotheses that I'm happy to share. But it clearly was a very beloved practice. And then, of course, they also gathered on Sundays to sing at Sabbath worship. And I've thought a little bit about what this might have sounded like, because Johnson in his diary, he describes that it's happening, but he doesn't say how it sounded. But I've thought about what language they might have been singing in, because there's multiple dialects that would have been at play because it's an intertribal community, but they all would share the same basic. They are under the same basic language group, the Pagasit group. So I've wondered, maybe it's a multilingual singing, or maybe everyone's sort of cohering around one dialect, or maybe they're singing in English because part of what Johnson was doing was teaching English there. But it's kind of interesting to imagine just even how they would have gathered all of this together, coordinated it musically. They might have been singing in unison, that is, all singing the same melody at the same time, or they might have been singing in three-part harmony. We know that Joseph Johnson describes hearing Oneida Indians singing in three-part harmony as they were taught to do by Jacob Fowler. And so it is possible that Johnson saw that and did the same in Farmington. So it's fun to start to begin to think about what this might have sounded like, instead of just saying like, oh, they were singing hymns. But the fact that Johnson only wrote that this was happening, he only says it happened in his diary. He doesn't say what it sounded like or really what it meant to him, but he does mention that he made these music books, which I think can tell us quite a lot. Which leads me to talking at greater depth about these handmade music books. So as a historian and as a musician, I'm really interested in how what written down music means to people. I find sort of colloquially that people who don't read music often apologize for that fact, as if it's some sort of personal deficit, which of course it is not. It's like apologizing for not speaking a language you don't know. It's not everyone's responsibility to read music. But the ability to transmit music across without hearing it, and the ability to sort of standardize music once you've written it down, it exists in one possible set form, is pretty powerful. And so I'm interested in that, what kind of power it conveys to people in the past as well as now. And it provides for us today a really vital mode of access to music in the past, of course, right? If you can get access to something that was written down 200 years ago, 400 years ago, it tells you more than you would have access to if you didn't have that, right? Even if it's sort of, not a complete picture. And one of the things I've come to love with my research is the experience of physically handling old music books, especially ones that were made by hand, that is the music notation was copied out by hand. when you can see them, and they are everywhere. I guarantee that if you go to your local, I can't guarantee this, but I would wager that if you go to your local historical society, like for me, that's the Pennsylvania Historical Society, they very well might have some 18th century little book where some anonymous person in the past took the time to copy out hymns or songs. It was an incredibly ubiquitous practice in the 18th century, which is kind of amazing because it's a very labor intensive practice. And when you get to handle these and interact with them, you can really come to appreciate how much not just the singing and the making of music mattered to people, which of course it did, it mattered quite a lot, but how much it mattered to people to physically have and hold a written emblem of that musical practice and that musical knowledge. And so that is apparently what was happening in Farmington, when Johnson was making these music books. They weren't just singing, they wanted these books. And I should say, and Gabriel knows this well, the interest in having singing books in this time is not unique to Johnson. Samson Occam writes regularly or repeatedly about sort of requesting specific music books for various communities with which he's working. And sometimes he's really particular. He'll say, I want this book. This is the one that we want. And he'll ask his patrons, like, hey, would you send me this? Send it to this person and I'll pick it up from them. So it's not as though this is a completely out of left field phenomenon that Johnson is doing this. But what's really surprising, or I should say really unusual, is that Joseph Johnson was making these music books. He wasn't writing away to a patron saying like, hey, would you send me some? He arrived in Farmington and started to make them himself, which I think is it's a really noteworthy phenomenon. So, because he could have asked for them, other people like Occam was asking for them, and Farmington was a relatively wealthy town, and when he was there, he was on pretty good terms with the white English settler colonists. He went and visited them and sang songs at their houses with them, so it was like fairly sociable. So he could have asked, but instead he makes them himself. And he calls these books that he's making gamuts. Gamuts. Gamut is the singular gamuts, which is a word I will explain in a little bit. And we know that he's making these gamuts and that he starts doing immediately on arrival because he starts writing about it in his diary, which is fantastic. And he'll say things like, I have a quote here from, so he starts making these basically immediately after the first singing evening that he gathers together. Right after that, he writes in his diary, quote, I made 3 gamuts or singing books, that is, cut them out and sewed them together. So that means he first he goes into town, he gets some paper, and he cuts the paper and stitches to make a sort of spine, and then begins to copy into them. And he continues to describe what he was copying, and I'll quote again here, quote, I began to write down the rules in one. And he goes on to say, quote, the Indians are all desirous of having gamuts, but I am in continual hurry. Nevertheless, I purpose to furnish them with singing books as soon as time will admit. So there's a lot of fun things in here. I began to write down the rules in one. I'm going to come back to that, but that's a big clue. And then that he says the Indians are all desirous of having gamuts. That's interesting, right? He's telling us like this is not just something he decided to do to see if they would like it. He's getting the sense that this is something that he's being tasked to do by the community that he has just joined. And he's very busy. He's in a continual hurry. And from his diary, it does sound like he's very, very busy. But he's doing this sort of on top of his regular workload. And sure enough, he sits down and works on these manuscript. And I keep saying manuscript music books because manuscript is hand copied or handwritten, and then they are books of music, so hence the term manuscript music books. He works on them basically every day for 2 weeks, and he often rises early in the morning in order to do this work. And he finishes the first book after about a week, and then he finishes the next book a couple days later, and he starts this pattern of finishing these books and then giving them away. And he doesn't just give them to anybody. He gives them to the prominent hosts that he's been living with and sort of working with in Farmington, starting with Samuel Adams, who also hosts the singing evenings, and with whom Johnson lived for a short period. He gives one to Hannah Robbins, another of the Native community at Farmington, with whom Johnson lodged for a while. So he makes these books and he sort of presents them to his hosts. And he continues doing that for about a month. He injures his leg, and so it sort of slows him down. But he continues doing that. And by the time he leaves Farmington to begin rallying support for the migration to Brothertown, he leaves in February to start doing that work. He has copied out 8 of these books, which is a lot of work. Okay, so I've already told you that these books don't exist anymore, but there is a really long and rich history of this kind of practice of copying out books by hand in a sort of amateur fashion. So he's not being paid to do this. It's not his job. It's maybe kind of part of his mission to do it, but it's not expected that he does this. And this is really common in the 18th century. When doing research for my previous, a book that I just finished, I looked at like over 100 of these kinds of hand-copied music books from 18th century New England. So they are ubiquitous. They're full of hymns or full of popular music of the 18th century, which is nothing like popular music of today. And I've thought a lot about why people do this. Like why would people write out music by hand like this? Because it's a really time-consuming process. And especially because this is a period in which there is printed music. And in New England, there's a huge industry of printed music. But printed music was kind of expensive. To buy just a piece of sheet music, so one piece, was 25 cents. And I don't know the rate of like how that translates to today, but it's expensive. It was something that only more elite people could have access to. So it was useful if you could copy out music for yourself, if you wanted to be able to sort of have it at home. It was also nice because you could share it with friends. Sometimes these books would sort of circulate among social groups, so it's very sociable. And then there's a sort of cultural cachet to being able to do this, because while alphabetic literacy, that is the ability to read and write and a language, that was very high at least among white English settler colonists of this period. Almost all men and a lot of the women in New England could read and write. But being able to read and write music is a more specialized ability. And so this sort of to be able to show off one's book is, I guess, a kind of a move that one could make to sort of highlight one's education. If they're hymns, it would be a way to say, like, look how pious I am. I even copied out my hymns. It's a way to show how genteel you are and cosmopolitan. So it's all of those kinds of things are wrapped up in creating these music books. But all of that is in the context of the Anglo-American cultural praxis of New England. So that's all about people who are descendants of Europeans and mostly of English people in New England. It's really unusual to hear about Native Americans being both musically literate, being able to read music, and also to be able to write music, because those are two separate skills. Writing is harder than reading. Usually comes first, and writing is a more advanced task. So the books don't exist anymore, but Johnson provides clues about what they might have contained and what they might have looked like. And he does this because he calls them gamuts, that term that I spelled out, and because he talks about copying the rules in them. And what he means when he says the rules of music or gamut is that he's referring to basically the building blocks of being able to read music. The rules of music in the 18th century refers to things like being able to read a scale, like read music notation on a scale, or be able to decode rhythm and understand what the notation looks like when you're notating rhythm. How to recognize meter. All of these are different components of music that you don't need to know in order to sing, but you do need to know in order to sing from written down music. And so he's and in this period, you have lots and lots of music publications that are providing these rules of music. It is a huge part of the music print industry to have tune books that begin with the rules of music. And I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute if I can get the screen sharing thing to work.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned that he is copying these books. Do you literally mean he is copying from something else?
So he doesn't tell us. I believe he would be, because it would be incredibly advanced if he was just recalling it from his mind. In his diary, he mentions returning a music book to one of the prominent English settler colonists in town. So if he's returning that book, maybe that means he had borrowed it on a previous visit and he just doesn't say so in his diary. But he doesn't tell us what it is. So I have no idea exactly what it is, but that is and he only returns it once he has finished copying out a couple of these books. So he started to do it, and now he has his own copies that he can then continue to copy to. It's such a good question, because copying, of course, it's like, what is he copying from? If he were just writing it, we might say he's composing,
right,
sort of coming up with it himself. But he doesn't say that he's doing that. He implies that he's sort of copying from another source. That's a really, yeah.
I have a couple comments maybe there. Composing is also like a word, since you mentioned right there, which in the time period then was very versatilely, interchangeably used for music or for poetry. Mm-hmm. So like later on in Joseph Johnson's writings, there's this letter that he sends to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he mentions he's enclosed a couple of pieces, mm-hmm, which he'd got printed, and and of his own composition, and those also were lost.
I know. I was so grateful when you drew my attention to that letter he writes to Sir William Johnson. And for those of you who don't know, Gabriel has scoured all of the archives he could think of to look for these pieces. And we don't know if they're poems or pieces of music that Johnson composed. It's a really interesting choice of word. But go ahead.
Also about the copying, following up answer about copying. In 1774, which is a little bit later, same year that Samson Occam published his hymnal, from the same printer in New London, Connecticut, Timothy Green Jr. there. Amos Bull, a known tune book composer, tunesmith guy, was advertised as having a gamut available and was published right there on that press. Interesting coincidence. The coincidences pile up enough that you wonder, right? But that's all it is until there's something that really connects. So is he copying, just the gamut from someone else? That's the usual thing with gamuts. Or is he copying tunes? And where did they come from? There's a breakdown in the question that would help to answer the parts of it. And mm-hmm, gamut is an easier answer, and the music is tougher and more interesting.
I know. And that's where, so Johnson in his diary, so Gabriel's talking about how there's these, basically it's like there's an instruction manual part, that's the rules of music, and then there's the actual hymns, and it's those are two different things, although in printed music they were together. So if you bought a printed hymn book or tune book, chances are it would start with the rules of music and then give you the hymns. And the conceit is that ostensibly someone should be able to buy this not knowing how to read music, teach themselves how to read music, and then sing, which for anyone who's ever, it's like, that would be you'd be brilliant if you were able to do that. I've looked at these and I thought, could I learn how to read music from this? And the answer is absolutely not. It's very confusing. Still, it's meant to make music literacy more democratically available. And that's what the aim was. But the Johnson in his diary refers both to making gamuts and to making singing books. And that the emphasis that he says singing book makes me think that he may have been copying hymn tunes as well. So it wasn't just for learning how to read music, it was also for singing from the books. And what I like about this, what I find enticing about this is not only that it's a really impressive amount of labor that Johnson did, but that it tells us something about what the Native community in Farmington wanted. So these are ancestors of Brothertown. that they wanted these books. So did they want them because they wanted themselves to be able to learn how to read music? That's kind of interesting. You know, there's that sort of possibility that there was a thirst for that level of highly technical knowledge is intriguing. So I'm construing all of this out of the fact that he uses the term gamut. And because I imagine that most of you don't know what that is, or haven't seen one before, I wanted to figure out if I can share my screen, because I have some. Oh, Megan, it says that host disabled attendee screen sharing. Is there any way to enable attendee screen sharing? Oh, I see. Now I'm the host. Welcome. Thank you. Okay, here we go. So can you see this? It says Glenda Goodman lecture.
Yes.
Great. All right. So here's an example of a gamut. Just take that in for a minute. This was published at the beginning of a well-known Philadelphia ecumenical tune book. So this was not meant for any particular denomination, made by James Lyon, called Urania. And this is the chart that comes at the beginning of the book. It's quite lovely with all that filigree at the side. And this is a version of a gamut that I'll walk you through it just briefly. We don't need to belabor the point, but the idea is that this is a technical chart meant to explain the different elements of music. So on the left-hand column with the alphabet, you have the alphabet of note names. You have then immediately to the right, you have the different clefs. So that gives like basically a vocal range. And then you start having the fa, sol, la. You might recognize those. Those sound like, those are shape note syllables, right? Yeah. So this is before shape note. Like all of this is before shape note. Johnson lived in a pre-shape note world. But this is a way by lining up, let's see, by lining up the letter with the solfege syllable, and then in the different keys, so this is in B, E, A, you should be able to match, basically memorize and match, like, okay, so if we're in A major, then, you know, what is a A in, or what is this note in A major? Oh, sorry, in A major. And you're supposed to be able to like memorize all of this. And that is learning the gamut or the rules of music. And if you're thinking that sounds really difficult, then you're right. It would be really difficult. This is not a way to learn how to read music. Here's another one that's a little bit more user-friendly from later in the 18th century. Andrew Law, also of Connecticut, published many tune books. And he does this handy thing where he puts the note names on the staff. And he has other things here, like he has different meters here, and he shows you what they look like in music. He talks about sharp keys and flat keys, and he has a bunch of information, more information about meters. And what we see is that these kinds of gamuts or rules of music are ubiquitous in these early tune books. So that's what I suspect is something like what Johnson was copying. And it's not that surprising that he would copy these. You might think like, why would you copy instructions that are hard to follow? But a lot of people did, actually. So I've pulled together some pictures, and this is from my research. This is from my home institution, actually, where people would be starting out their hand-copied manuscript music books, and they would start by copying the gamut or the scale of music or various other aspects of music theory, basically. And sometimes you can tell exactly what they were copying from. So for instance, this here is a manuscript at Old Sturbridge Village, and it's very, very nice handwriting, as you can see. And this fellow, Joseph Ackerman, copied directly from that same Andrew Law tune book I just showed you. And I can tell this because it's identical. You can really see, including the down, down, up, up, the sort of hand conducting that would be accompanying that. You can sort of, it's smudged on this copy, but the same thing is here. So people did copy directly from these tune books, as I suspect as a way to try to learn these rules of music. Here's another example. Women did it too. Catherine Osborne. This is at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. So she copies this pyramid that is made to help people learn the different divisions of music, so whole notes, half notes, etc. She also copied that from Andrew Law. You can see the exact same chart here. So this is a kind of interesting common practice. And so Johnson was doing this too. So what's interesting isn't that, what's striking here is that I don't believe anyone knew that Native Christian converts were doing this as well. This, up till now, I think it was understood to be a practice done by people of European descent. At least that's my understanding. There's another way in which looking at these kinds of still existing music books can help us, though, and that is that there are hundreds of these hand-copied music books that do still exist in New England. And from looking at them, I think we can begin to just imagine what Johnson's books would have looked like. So here's one, and I like this because Johnson describes cutting the books and sewing them by hand. And you can see here the hand sewing of this. This one is in Litchfield, Connecticut. And you can get a sense of how, you can imagine how this would get lost. It's quite fragile. Here's another one. These books are usually oblong. I'm showing you oblong ones because that's the format or the shape that sacred books usually were. And an oblong book is nice because you can lay it open and multiple people can crowd around and look at it. So it's a really sociable book format. Here's one. I wanted to give a sense of how marvelous these manuscript books can be because they're personal. Who knows, maybe Johnson inscribed the books he was making for each person he was giving them to. I like this one because it has these doodles. There are doodles everywhere in these manuscript music books, and some of them are really funny. So I wanted to share these with you just to sort of plant the idea that maybe even though these books are no longer available, Johnson's books are no longer available for us to look at least not as far as I know, right? Maybe they are somewhere, but how would we ever figure that out? I wanted to share them with you to sort of help us imagine what it would be like to reconstruct these really precious, very fragile and vulnerable materials that have since been lost, but still, I think, have a lot to say about the cultural heritage that Johnson brings to Brothertown. I think I'll end there.
Anybody have any questions?
I'm also happy to share that PDF as a PDF, all those pictures. And I also created a sort of resource, a page where I give resources for everything I just showed. But I would love any questions or even just thoughts about what this makes you think about. I know that there's a lot of interest in shape note, and I wonder how this resonates with the shape note work you all have been doing.
I wish that Ginny were not frozen. Oh, she just came back.
Yeah. I'm sitting back. My computer is on a desk that has this backdrop of this white wall. I'm wondering, there's no mention of the tunes, of any tune names, or you said you were researching how you find out what music sounded like. So it's easy to see how you figure out what might have been in a gamut, but you said you didn't know whether they were singing unison or in parts.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any lists of tunes that these communities had?
No, not that I know of, but actually Gabriel's comment from earlier about looking who was publishing music in the vicinity, I think that would give me a really good head start on answering that question. And honestly, I think that even without being able to pin down and say exactly it must have been, they were definitely singing this song, I think that in terms of reconstructing a really a music practice that is important but hasn't left a lot of durable traces, I think even just saying okay, they might have been singing this, so this might be how it sounded. And especially if we think if they were singing this and sort of doing an ad hoc translation of if there was like a translation that they were maybe doing to put it in their native tongue, like what might that have sounded like? I think all of those sorts of speculative ways of answering the question could still give us important answers, because, you know, when you're talking about something in the past, you never really know. Like, you can come as close, you can get as much as you can to come as close as you can to saying, okay, I think this is it. But ultimately, like, we weren't there, so we won't know. But that's the kind of, my next step is to actually think, okay, so if I just say hypothetically, if they were singing this, what might it have sounded like? But I haven't reached that step yet.
I was going to say, this may not be helpful, but Samson Occam, in one of his letters, he talks about how the Indians really liked Dr. Watts.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. It's really striking how much Watts comes up. And not just for, I mean, because he's a really popular hymnodist for everyone who converted as part of the Great Awakening, the evangelical religious revival movement, which is how Joseph Johnson's parents converted to Christianity. So yeah, Watts is a really important figure, for sure.
I have a question for you about, you mentioned the social aspect of gametes and kind of sharing them. And I'm curious, like, as you're trying to reconstruct and think about, okay, what would this have sounded like? What would the experience have been of having these singing meetings with these music books? How would that have been different from having printed books? Like, is the social experience different with these sort of handcrafted gametes that are, you know, more unique? You don't, you know, not every person is given a carbon copy of like a printed book. And if you've thought at all about kind of like how that impacts the way that the communal aspect of what was going on at Farmington.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some feedback. Does anyone else hear that? Okay, rectified. So with the way that the uniqueness of these handmade music books would have impacted the social aspect, I think there's a couple of things. One is that in the manuscript books that I have looked at, so obviously not from Farmington, not from Johnson, sometimes there will be these sort of notes to loved ones in them, where they'll say like, oh, I copied this for my daughter, or I copied this for my mother. So there is like direct, you know, pointing fingers being like, look, it's sociable. It's like, it's showing how intimate these books could be, which you could get, you know, you could say, I give this printed book to my mother, but there's something different when you've taken the time and labor to copy it out by hand. So there's like direct evidence like that. And then, but I've actually been thinking about this actually in terms, I spent some time thinking about what cultural practices and philosophies the Native community in Farmington would have been accustomed to from their ancestors, that they might have brought to bear when they're working with these and like seeing these manuscript books. And actually, I've been thinking about this in terms of wampum, the strings and belts of shell beads that, of course, are a form of communication, also a form of reciprocal alliance making and agreement, a form of mapping and speaking and bearing witness to community intra-community connections. So that is how I've been thinking about it, because wampum is, in my completely amateur, so I'm just drawing on scholars' work like Lisa Brooks and Marge Bruchac, who've written about wampum extensively. And from what I understand, the handcraft of making wampum beads, of carving them out and weaving them, is part of what gives the belts and the strings of beads their living power. You know, that they really are, they're not dead texts, they're really like living materials that speak to their communities. So I've been thinking about the importance, the sort of investment of handwork as part of what, just in and of itself, as part of what could have given these manuscript books their power. And then more specifically, the way Johnson gave these books to his hosts, you know, sort of solidifying these relationships with his hosts by presenting them with these manuscript books. I think also, you know, I think I understand it better if I think about it in terms of the reciprocity that wampum sort of stood for.
Do you have any insight as to why Johnson chose or ended up in Farmington at the time that he did?
Yeah, he writes about it. And Laura Murray, who put together the edited volume of Johnson's letters and diaries, she writes about this as well. He had, Johnson is interesting because he goes away to school really young and then becomes a missionary in Oneida very young, in his teens, and has a really negative, it sounds like a fairly negative experience. A lot of his students were older than him. He couldn't really control them or get them to do what he thought they were supposed to be doing. He was accused of backsliding by Samuel Kirkland, his sort of white superior, the person he was answerable to. He was, spoken negatively of by Samuel Kirkland, and Johnson, as some of you might know, he actually ran away for a while. He became a sailor, and like many Native Americans in New England did, he became a sailor, sailed all around the Atlantic basin, went to the Azores, went to the Caribbean, and then came back to Mohegan, his ancestral homeland, and lived with his uncle for a while, for maybe a year, I believe, just working on his farm. And then he has this rebirth, this like new religious awakening while at his uncle's farm. And he writes about it in detail in his diary. And it's after that experience where he's like sort of has this new conversion to Christianity and new passion about his faith that he sets off. And I believe on his way, he ends up in Farmington, but he doesn't know where he's on his way to. And if I'm remembering right, in his diary, he sort of describes coming to a crossroads and saying, should I, like trying to see if there was any inkling, from, I guess, the Lord, like, where should I go? Although I'm not sure, because I'm now just trying to remember the diary, but so I might be wrong about this, but I believe he sort of takes it as a sign that he's like, okay, I'll go on this road to Farmington. Or maybe he encounters someone who says, why don't you go to Farmington, or something like that. It's something where it's like, it feels like it's beyond his power. He's not like self-directed. He's sort of taking cues and signs. And so he ends up in Farmington. And when he arrives, he asks the tribal elders, would you like me to be your teacher? And they say yes. And then he goes to the English settler colonial leaders and says, I would like to be a teacher here. And they say, can you read and write? And he shows that he can. And so they say yes. And that's how he ends up there. Does that answer the question? I feel like I maybe got off track in telling the story.
No.
Okay.
I mean, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I have a vague memory, and I can't say if it was even in Murray or if this note might be found elsewhere. Megan might remember, but I have a vague memory that somebody in Farmington asked, and it got around the word, and got to Occam, and he's like, no, I'm busy here, and people come and visit me from all over the world, and I have to stay here and be there for them, and I got a big family, and he had to stay. But here, I recommend. I feel like he or somebody, maybe Wheelock, that somebody recommended him when like a plea like circulated somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I can't put that together exactly or remember where I read, but I have that sense.
I think what's interesting is that he ends up there after he has this new conversion. It's like, it's a good timing for him personally. Like if it had been 4 years earlier, he probably wouldn't have had the capacity to do all the work that he ended up doing in Farmington. But the timing is everything. And
that conversion you mentioned was like near, he was in Mohegan. He was near enough to Occam's to, walk and do chores and, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there other questions?
Yeah, I do have another question. So as you said, we don't know where any of the gametes are now, any of Johnson's gametes. But have you been able to follow any of them out of Farmington? And maybe no?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off with your question.
No, it's okay. It definitely answers it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you mentioned, I think, a couple of names of people who we know that he gave these to. Do you have more than those two names?
I don't believe I do. I'd have to go back to my notes.
Yeah, Johnson refers to more.
And then also he says that he gave one to Wadsworth, although we don't know which Wadsworth. And I've spent a lot of time. He refers to. I can go into the technicality of why we don't know it, but we don't know which Wadsworth. So he refers to that as well. And it would be really interesting to try to follow Hannah Robbins, for example, to see, where she ends up. And that's something I haven't done yet, but I think that'd be a really good path to pursue.
Yeah, because go ahead, Gabriel.
You're probably saying it. I think she's in love in the genealogy and was in Brothertown. I think some of the specific native names are named later as in New York, Old Brothertown. And yes, I can't list out all the names right now, but Robbins, that was a mother-daughter or a couple of sisters. I think both of them got gametes from Johnson, and the landlord Wadsworth he mentioned, and there were at least 2 or 3 other names. He names at least 6 of them. I think really? 5 or 6.
Okay, I'll go back to my notes.
Yeah, if we went back.
Okay,
I think
that's good. I'll definitely check
names
that.
1 or 2 more. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I noticed you said something. I was going to take this in a different path here, Gabriel. So if you've got something about this, you may want to say it.
No, it was different. Go, please.
I was going to say, you mentioned that anybody who could learn or teach themselves music through these gametes must be some sort of a genius. That may not be the exact word, but something like that. And of course, we know from Kamuk in his tune book, that's exactly how he supposedly learned music.
Yeah. I don't know how he would have done that. I have no intention of casting doubt on that he did it, but
seems impossible.
He's remarkable. I don't know what to say about that. It's really, I think that what I would say is that it can't possibly just be from the book, right? It must also be from a communal music making practice, right? I hadn't actually put that together. Thanks for reminding me of that, because whenever I look at these, I look at them as someone who studied music, and I'm like, if I had just been handed this book, I would never have learned from it.
Yeah.
But I have to be careful not to take my current experiences and apply them to people in the past. But because they are confusing charts, but I suppose if you're really intent on gleaning every bit of information you can from them, you definitely could, like Kamuk did.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's important, like you said, that he came from the singing community. It's not like he just popped out with us out in the desert somewhere and there it is. So he had that from the community, and then he, looked at it a little more closely and got some more out of it.
On this topic, I have a facsimile of Kamuk's Indian melodies. Sorry, the shiny cover makes that impossible. He explains a little more precisely what he did. There's a tune in the book that is going around the shape note singing circles a lot now, getting popular, Old Indian Hymn. And he has a footnote there about Narragansett traditions at the time he wrote it, over 200 years old, plus, before the time of the Pilgrims landing Plymouth. And that he was just writing down this tune as it's been remembered ever since then. So that indicates that he's been a part of that he grew up there, Narragansett in Rhode Island, and was singing there and learned this from there. And he remembered it all his life and wrote it down finally as an adult. In his preface, he describes, it was not until the year 1830s, something that he first commenced trying to learn, scientifically, the art of singing. So all that he did, that he taught himself through the gametes and introductions was music literacy. He'd been a singer and he knew all kind of music. Knew all kind of music, seriously already, and just got a little bit more literate and a little more Western harmony standard part writing, maybe perhaps something like that.
The whole to say that something is scientific in the 18th century is to say that it follows the what we call in musicology world, sort of common practice, harmony, and voice leading. So that means like there are rules for how music is supposed to sound, and if you don't follow them, you aren't composing scientifically. A ton of early New England composers didn't follow the rules, like William Billings is one who composed around the era of the American Revolution in Boston. And a lot of people loved the way his music sounded, but he was correctly told that he wasn't being scientific. It's kind of like if you were to speak colloquially in a sort of vernacular style of speaking that isn't completely grammatically accurate in terms of, the rules of English grammar, but you can still be understood, and actually maybe people prefer speaking that way because it gets different kinds of points across. The same thing applies with music. You can say like, oh, it's not scientific, but it still might sound really good. But Kamuk was learning how to follow all of those rules in addition to the practices that he was familiar with.
I have a couple previous. That's noise from my end, huh? I have a couple previous details I can tie together a touch, or maybe ask something about. I noticed, Jenny, I know in uncanny number of different ways, but mostly lately through Sacred Harp, shape note singing networks, and we bump into each other there sometimes. And it's interesting that a social singer like herself would, when questions come, immediately ask about tune names. Tell me about the tune names. What's the list of tune names? And that's one of the answers to how are these manuscripts that are being made ubiquitously, how are they useful for social singers? You don't copy entire books, you copy tunes, individual tunes, popular tunes that travel well. And that's what the singer asks for. What's your list? Then I can get those tunes, I can travel, I can come sing with you, right? Like that, this is what people are doing. They're just choosing popular tunes. And you mentioned the revolutionary time, of William Billings being all popular, but also revolutionary era and for some years after getting going again, there was vast demand for every bit of metal that could have been a piece of printing plate or type, and for the resources of the skilled workers, and for just everything, paper, for just everything into the war efforts and just running things, and so printing went into the war, and therefore manuscript writing went way up, and that lasted for a long time, and there's articles about that, and it impacts all of this in exactly the important timing era, and then there's rebound from that goes on for decades. Also kind of important in all these trends that are intersecting so complexly here. It's just cool, complicated stuff.
Thanks for sharing that.
Anybody else? No? Well, thank you so much, Professor Goodman, for speaking with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming and spending some of your Sunday with me and listening to me share my research. I'm happy if anyone wants to get in touch. I guess, Megan, you have my contact information. Please feel free to share it broadly. This is a topic that I'm very interested in hearing from people about as I continue to work on it. So this was helpful for me as well, and I hope it was informative for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
I see
Thank
this. Thank you from
Thank you
Paul
so much.
in chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very nice work.
Being late.
And as another like researcher and like outsider, when I just want to echo when she says this, she's very interested in hearing from people about this work. Like that is so for real. Like, give a holler, get in touch, because like nobody knows this stuff, and so you go in alone, and it's like blind and crazy, and it's pretty cool to talk to anybody who knows anything and like cares a bit. So please do.
Yes. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you. Nice work.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, enjoy the rest of your Sundays.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Got a
There we go. She was the host for a while and I couldn't turn off the recording.